So welcome everyone, and welcome to this 8th session in CARE's World Class New Zealand Speaker Series. So the aim of the speaker series is to highlight the incredible stories of our world-class New Zealanders and inspire other Kiwi to push the boundaries of their own business goals and expectations. And we've got people online today from the UK, from Europe, from China, from Singapore, from Australia and New Zealand. So we have a truly global audience here to learn about globalisation and the impact of Ukraine, which is fantastic. I am delighted to introduce Dr. David Skilling, Director at Netherlands-based Landfall Strategy Group. Landfall is an advisory group that provides insights on global economics, on policy and on politics to governments, to firms and to financial institutions. And they really have just an unparalleled focus on application to small advanced economies such as New Zealand. Prior to Landfall, David was a senior advisor on strategy to the secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade based in Singapore. He was a senior fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute and the founding CEO of the New Zealand Institute, which is a non-partisan public policy think tank that provided sort of perspectives on policy issues in New Zealand. And the work that David led here resulted in really meaningful policy impact, including things such as the introduction of KiwiSaver. David's also the author of a regular Substack publication called Small World. And at the end of the session, we'll be popping the links up in the chat for anybody that would like to subscribe and just keep informed on what's going on. So welcome along, David, to the CARE World Class New Zealand Speaker Series.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Morning in the Netherlands. So over the next 15 minutes or so, David is going to be setting the scene for us. He's going to be talking through some of the economic and political trends that he's seeing both in New Zealand and globally, the ongoing impact of the Ukraine, and also providing some insights for us into the opportunities for global economies in the future. Then what we'll be doing is moving right into Q&A, and from the questions that have been submitted by people at registration, I think the Q&A session is going to be very lively, which I'm very much looking forward to. So without further ado, I will hand over to David to do the kickoff for us. Thank you, David.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here with you this morning my time and perhaps this evening in New Zealand. So what I thought I would do is just provide 10-15 minutes of opening remarks to kind of frame up the conversation and give a sense of the world as I see it, both in an economic and political context. And obviously there is an enormous amount underway at the moment, so it's difficult to cover it off in an abbreviated fashion like this. But let me just give a sense of what I see happening, and also I think what the implications might be for either firms and investors in New Zealand or folks that still have an interest in New Zealand, because New Zealand, although it is obviously physically isolated from many of these developments, is I think pretty directly exposed, and there are going to be meaningful impacts on New Zealand. So I mean, if you look around the world, clearly there are a range of economic and geopolitical disruptions underway. On the economic side, and some of you may have seen the IMF's put out their latest forecast yesterday, we've got rapidly softening rates of GDP growth with mounting downside risks. So China, the Eurozone, the US are all stalling quite sharply. At the same time, we've got inflation that's at multi-decade highs. In Europe, at least, that's on the back of surging energy prices. So we're in for a fairly long, cold and expensive winter here. Food and commodity prices have been all over the place. And as well, we've got sharp currency and market movement. So there's a lot of economic noise, most of which is negative in nature. There haven't been too many positive surprises for a while. And you put alongside that, obviously, geopolitical tensions, most obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And despite the fact that Ukraine is making some progress on the battlefield, its economy is being progressively destroyed. Also significant impacts on Russia. But of course, there are spillover effects. Energy and oil and gas prices are just one obvious example of that, but food prices as well. In the Asia Pacific, we've got growing tensions in and around China, that's most obviously Taiwan, but increasingly the Pacific as well. So there is a lot of noise. And of course, that's not even getting into domestic political issues in the US and the UK and the like. So I think, there's many things to kind of be looking at. And I guess when I look at these things, it's not so much understanding the tactical issues, what's going on day to day or even week to week. It's trying to get a read on what's happening under the surface. What are the structural things? And to me, when you see as much economic and political disruption as we are seeing. And of course, we're coming off the back of the pandemic as well. To me, that kind of captures and reflects underlying structural or regime change in the global system. And I think after a few decades of a reasonably stable consensus with what Tom Friedman called the flat world, or the Washington consensus, or the end of history, a sense that global markets were open, you could trade across markets, there was a sense of geopolitical stability. That consensus is at best fraying, and I think more likely is to be exiting. And that old system, I think, has been, or the exit of that old system has been accelerated, has been expedited by the pandemic and the disruption that caused, and again given another push by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in terms of people needing to face up to some emerging realities, be they geopolitical or economic. And so I think it's pretty clear, at least to me, that the functioning of the global system is changing. So I don't buy into the narrative of the end of globalization. I think that this is going to completely unwind or reverse. I think there are very powerful forces that are going to keep global flows keeping on. For countries, for firms, external engagement is a commercial and an economic imperative, and particularly for smaller economies like New Zealand, being able to trade and invest beyond our small domestic market remains an imperative. But at the same time, it is changing. And although we saw through COVID trade flows remain pretty resilient, even US-China trade flows remain at record levels. So some of the headlines are perhaps a little bit exaggerated. But even so, we're moving into a period where there are more frictions, there are more tensions, and we are moving, as I said, out of a period where kind of hyper-globalization was the narrative to something that is a bit different. And I think it's partly for economic reasons. Firms are looking to engineer more resilience into their supply chains, which often means sort of physical compression of supply chains, bringing them back closer to home, so get away from kind of Suez Canal type events or other frictions of supply chains. In many cases, technology makes it easier to reshore or nearshore. So there are some, if you like, commercial incentives around sort of a more regional model of a global economy, where things aren't as far-flung as they used to be. But also, of course, there are political drivers of this as well, both domestic political drivers, through the pandemic and since. We've seen governments, particularly in advanced economies, much more thoughtful around, in the language, strategic autonomy. If they want to gain control over sensitive goods, be they pharmaceuticals or energy, or in some cases technology, as is the case in the US of semiconductors. So a sense that you want to bring stuff back closer to home to have greater autonomy, greater control. But also geopolitics is becoming a much greater driver. We are seeing the early days of what I think is going to become quite a dominant theme for the next few years and beyond, of decoupling. And although, as I said, US-China trade flows, even EU-China trade flows are sitting at or about record highs, we are beginning to see a process of pretty deliberate decoupling. That's most obvious in the technology space, with the US, Europe, and others putting various restrictions on investment into China in the technology space, restrictions in and around semiconductors, the US trying to bring semiconductor production back. You see the similar things in Europe as well. And I think we are going to see this gradual pulling apart, this kind of fragmentation of the global economy. Again, it's partly for economic and commercial reasons, but importantly going forward, it is going to be for geopolitical reasons as well. The US and Europe are looking to reduce their exposure to China as geopolitical tensions rise. And I think in Europe that has been emphasized, I suppose, by a sense of their naivety in terms of how they dealt with Russia, particularly in the energy front. You're becoming much too exposed to Russia and now paying the cost for that. And I think they kind of take that and they read that across to China and say, look, we don't want to put ourselves in a position where we are too deeply exposed to a geopolitical rival. Now, that's not going to be binary. China is far too important a market to decouple from in entirety, but I think there's going to be a process of recalibration. And for its part, China is also looking at what the West collectively did to Russia after its invasion, ejection from a SWIFT international financial system, sanctions, freezing of central bank assets, and China, for its part, is accelerating its plans for self-sufficiency, looking to reduce its exposure to the West. So you put those two things together, and we are, I think, going to see a fragmentation, a pulling apart of the global system, again, both for economic and political reasons. So although that's not the end of globalization, I think it is quite a different model. It's much more regional, it's much more political in nature. This notion of friendshoring, a term coined by Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, there's this notion that you increasingly do business with countries, with firms who are friends and allies and partners. and you're less inclined to do business with countries that are in opposing geopolitical camps, I think is going to gain more currency. Again, that's not absolute, but I think there is a fairly clear direction of travel. So we are moving to a more fragmented model of the global system. And these are structural drivers. This is not simply a function of Ukraine being invaded or the pandemic. These were pre-existing dynamics that have been underway for some time, but have a degree of logic and inevitability to them, but they are accelerating and becoming more strategic. And so I think for countries, particularly smaller countries that are deeply exposed to the global system, of which New Zealand is one, really getting a sense of how do these dynamics affect the way in which we do business? How do they affect the outlook for our respective countries? And as I said at the top, although New Zealand at one level is not particularly exposed to what's going on in Europe, I mean, New Zealand's exports to Russia are trivial. Ukraine is on the other side of the world. I think New Zealand is at least as exposed to other countries of our size, and the reason for that is our exposure to China. Clearly, as I've mentioned a few times, the degree of geopolitical competition and rivalry between, let's call it the West, and China is increasing. It's clearly been stepping up for some time under the Obama administration. Clearly, Mr. Trump and the trade wars took it a further step on. And under the Biden administration, despite the more diplomatic rhetoric, it's one of the few bipartisan issues that the US has, is being hawkish on China. I spend quite a bit of time talking to US policymakers, and I'm continuously struck by the very hawkish, very assertive tone on China, and that's replicated, frankly, in Beijing as well. President Xi is about to get a third term at the party meetings later this month. And so I think, both in Beijing and Washington, you see this very hawkish tone and a sense of pulling apart and more friction and more rivalry. So these dynamics, I think, are going to go on for some time. And New Zealand, of course, is very deeply exposed to its relations with China. About 35% of our merchandise trade goes to China. It's a big source, at least pre-COVID, of tourism, of migration, of capital flows, and the like. And much of New Zealand's growth, well, a significant chunk of New Zealand's growth has been supported quite meaningfully by strong import demand growth out of China over the last 10 or 15 years. It's gone from circa 5-6% of New Zealand's merchandise trade to 35% or so over a 15-year period. So that's been a fantastic source of support. It helped New Zealand coming out of the global financial crisis, helped us again through the pandemic. And although New Zealand is not the same as Australia, Australia, of course, has run a more hawkish, more US-aligned policy on China than has New Zealand, which has preferred to be more diplomatic, more neutral, more independent. I think New Zealand's ability to maintain that fine equilibrium of kind of balancing is going to become more and more complicated to do. And I'm now sitting in Europe after 11 years sitting in Singapore. And watching Europe begin to grapple with how it engages with China, both a geopolitical rival, but also a large market, is instructive, and realizing that you can't have your cake and eat it. There are some trade-offs, and they are going to be costly. And I think for New Zealand, trying to figure out, how do we read that relationship with China? How rapidly is this decoupling going to proceed? How many frictions are there likely to be that Taiwan, be it closer to home in the Pacific? And what choices are going to be forced on us? And I think, increasingly, as we've seen over the last 3-4 months, New Zealand is going to come under increasing pressure from our traditional friends, the US, Australia, to declare our hand. So we are moving into a world, I think, where more deliberate choices are going to be required of us, where things are going to be more difficult to navigate. We are going to have to be a lot more thoughtful and a more strategic and purposeful about how we engage with the world. The good news, I suppose, at least as I see it, and I spend a lot of time working with small advanced economy governments, but also firms and financial institutions in those small countries, is that although small economies are deeply exposed to what I think is becoming a more challenging global environment, small economies also have a very strong record of resilience. They continue to perform even when the global economy is not looking so shiny. They did very well in and around the GFC. They outperformed through the pandemic. And my read at the moment in terms of policy conversations in at least the high-performing small advanced economies is they are thinking very, very hard about how do you engage, how do you position yourself, what choices do you make? And the nice thing about small economies is that they are agile and responsive. And exactly because they are so exposed to these developments, there is a degree of kind of intensity about these debates. These are not simply academic debates. These are debates that are almost existential in nature. And interestingly, the common response is not so much trying to move into a defensive crouch or move away from global engagement, rather it's to double down. As I said earlier in the call, for smaller economies and for firms and investors out of smaller economies, international engagement remains an imperative. The fact that it's more difficult doesn't change that basic fact. But the way in which you engage has to be more thoughtful. You are going to have to make some strategic calls about your partners of choice, about where you are going to be competitive and be a lot more purposeful. The last 10, 20, 30 years have not been straightforward, but it's been punctuated by crisis, but it has been easier. There hasn't been a need to make as many strategic choices. And I think that world is changing. And so, the small economies that I think recognize that quickly and respond effectively will continue to do well. We saw that in the last regime change from the early 90s. Countries that figured out what the next regime of globalization was going to look like, be it supply chains and the like, and moved quickly into that new world, did much better than those countries that were more sluggish. So I think that the overall point I guess that I'm trying to make is that the surface level disruption that we see around the world, economic, political, geopolitical, and other, to me, is symptomatic of a more underlying deep structural set of changes as well. And as New Zealand, but also as firms and investors, we need to be thoughtful around what that means for us. We can't dismiss it as something will settle down in 12, 18 months. We're going from a period of what the economists called the great moderation to something that's going to be the great turbulence or the great volatility. These sort of shocks and disruptions are going to be with us for some time. And we need to both understand those risks and manage against them. At the same time as trying to figure out where the opportunities might be. And every time there is a period of disruption, there are opportunities that present themselves as well. So, although moving into a defensive crouch might be one response, it's not the only response. So perhaps let me pause there. I think, as I said, there's lots of implications, I think, for New Zealand, as well as firms, investors, countries around the world. And I think, we can't treat our physical isolation as a buffer against which we do need to engage in a front-footed way. So perhaps let me pause there and I'll hand back and looking forward to the questions.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. So before I do kick into the first question, I'm just keen for you to define, when you're talking about small advanced economies, can you give us examples of which economies you're referring to there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, it's always a bit arbitrary, but for me, it's countries, advanced economies, so industrialized, rich by per capita income centers, with a population of below 20 million, or frankly below 10 million. So, it's the Nordics, it's Ireland, it's Switzerland, it's Israel, it's Singapore, it's New Zealand, and the like. And these are countries that are, have performed well. They tend to perform well both economically and on all of the metrics that you think about: well-being, happiness, trust, quality of political institutions, and the like. And there is, a secret sauce to these countries. They do well for similar-ish reasons: investment in skills, innovation, and the like. And it's a group of countries that I think New Zealand in particular has a lot to learn for. We often look to Australia, to the UK, to the US. For my money, I think there's a lot more we can learn, both in a policy sense, but also, frankly, in a business sense, from looking to the Nordics, to Switzerland, and the like, for guidance. So, that's who I'm talking about.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so when we spoke earlier this week, we talked about, the situation as COVID arose, and boards and lead teams in New Zealand, sort of small, medium businesses particularly, and in fact, probably businesses all around the world, were grappling in many cases for the very first time with understanding business continuity planning. And some of the situations that you've just talked through, it's just been unprecedented situation on top of unprecedented situation. So I guess when you're trying to do a business continuity plan and you're looking at what's the likelihood of this happening and then what's the sort of impact of it, do you have advice for boards and for lead teams that might be quite new to business continuity as to how to really navigate through this crazy time that we're in at the moment?
Yeah, I guess my first response would be to reiterate a point I think I made in my remarks, which is get used to it. Which is, this has not just been an unfortunate period of 4 or 5 years of pandemic and Ukraine and inflation and the like. Yes, that's true. These things are, to an extent, unprecedented. We haven't had a pandemic of a scale for, I guess, since the Spanish flu a century ago. But these type of events are going to become more regular and more frequent. There are going to be more economic, financial, technology, political, geopolitical shocks. And so just recognizing we are in a new regime that is going to be more volatile and more turbulent. Embracing ourselves for that. So, thinking in advance around buffers, around redundancy, around resilience, be that supply chains or levels of gearing or whatever it is. I think kind of those, it's hard. It's not even so much business continuity. It's more just kind of strategic planning. How do we think about our business? How resilient are we to these shocks? And I think really investing much more heavily in areas such as strategic foresight, on really developing a granular sense of what your exposures are to various international dynamics in a way that many New Zealand firms, and frankly firms in general, haven't been as compelled to do over the last period of time, simply because the world has been tidier, less volatile, and the like. But as we do move into a new world, being prepared for these type of events and having a sense of which of these various developments and fault lines are most relevant to our business is going to become important. So I think trying to put yourself in a position where you are less likely to be surprised. Not saying you won't be surprised, but you're less likely to be surprised by running structured scenarios and like stress testing the business model for various kind of 3 or 4 sigma events. They become much more important to do. And so a theme of resilience, I think, ensuring that you are resilient to these shocks, but you are thinking about the range of scenarios that might impact your business, I think becomes not just an academic exercise that you do once every few years, but I think needs to become much more routine part of the business. I have to say that in many cases, business overperformed through the pandemic. If you look at the pace and materiality of the changes that were implemented, for many firms, implementing working from home overnight, or going online almost overnight, or accelerating various CapEx plans. So business was able to turn on a dime in many cases and do actually quite well. But you don't want to have to be surprised like that every 1 or 2 years. So I think just being as prepared, making those investments and really understanding the world. And I think for New Zealand, we are exposed to what happens overseas, and so really making an investment not just in understanding the New Zealand context, but the regional international context, I think, is a much more important part of just regular business.
Yeah, thank you. That makes complete sense. And yeah, I think as you've described, it's not going away. So it needs to kind of be baked into the hygiene of the way that you do business from now. So I have a question around, so you talked about the global economy fragmenting a little bit, and not necessarily quite localization, but that sort of pull for countries to maybe source a little bit more domestically, or not, where things are critical, not necessarily export as much. So, I'm really curious to understand what kind of impact you think this may have on free trade agreements. Does it sort of reverse some of those really hard-won negotiated points in some of the recent high-quality free trade agreements?
So I think no. I mean, the pace of signing free trade agreements has slowed. I mean, New Zealand, we've got a first-rate team of trade negotiators who continue to do a good job. The UK, the EU deal that's just been signed. But there's not, I mean, aside from India perhaps, which is challenging, there's not a huge kind of pipeline of meaningful FTAs. And that's true for many other countries. And so I don't see that there's going to be an unwinding, in part because the free trade agreements we have work for both parties. Our FTA, even with China, continues to work well. It was upgraded not too recently. So I think I don't see these things being unwound as much as a sense of I don't see much upside, right? So yes, there will continue to be deals. And Trans-Pacific Partnership was fantastic. There might be some countries added to that over time, although that's kind of slow progress on the margin. But FTAs are deeply contested for domestic political reasons. I mean, the EU is dragging its feet on many kind of open FTAs. I think New Zealand is less at risk, but Mercosur in Latin America and others, those FTAs are being are not being expedited, if you like. But I think that the issue is increasingly, the countries with whom you do FTAs are more likely to be countries with whom you have strong kind of geopolitical alignment. So yes, a bunch of countries have FTAs with China. I think going forward, the ability for again, Western countries to sign meaningful FTAs with China is going to narrow. The EU has a thing called the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with China, but over the last few years has basically been frozen in place. It's not going to make much progress. So I think what is currently in place will remain in place. These FTAs are not going to be unwound, but I think we are going to see much tighter alignment between FTAs and kind of geopolitical groupings. And again, these are this fragmentation is not going to be binary. I don't think we're not going to move into a world with simply 2 blocks. It's going to be a lot messier than that. There's going to be a lot of countries trying to develop space for themselves in the middle. But FTAs, I think, one, are going to be much more kind of geopolitically organised and framed than they have been. And secondly, I would say that FTAs, are probably not the main game in town anyway. I mean, for firms, particularly for New Zealand, because FTAs cover a lot of our agricultural exports, which are historically very exposed to various tariffs and non-tariff barriers. But for many countries, FTAs are a nice thing to have, but they're not the binding constraint on this national expansion. Right, so governments will do what they have to do. But for firms figuring out how do you navigate this environment, how do you develop a compelling value proposition to get you into market, how do you understand that market, those are things that are probably more important. But even there, you can't escape from politics. And I think there is going to be a sense in which, your country of domicile, if you're a New Zealand firm, you implicitly carry the New Zealand flag with you. If you're from Australia, similarly, if you're from the US, similarly. So you can't escape from this. So FTAs, I think, they're going to remain in place. But going forward, even if they do remain in place, we're going to have to navigate politics and geopolitics and be a lot more thoughtful around that, and be a lot more thoughtful about the risk profile. I mean, as I didn't say this in my remarks, but I said it implicitly, as relations between New Zealand and, let's say, China become more prickly, as there's more areas of potential dispute. The Pacific, Solomon Islands, China's been Pacific is one area where there's clearly scope for tension to arise between New Zealand and China. If there was an invasion, which I don't think is likely, but if there was an invasion of Taiwan by China, again, that would be a clear point of friction. So we are going to encounter, after the golden web of the last 15 years in terms of bilateral relations, we are going to encounter more of these frictions. And so New Zealand firms, I think, need to go through an exercise of recalibrating what that geopolitical risk profile is, how much of that risk they're prepared to accept, given the size of the market and the margins you can earn in that market, and figure out, what's the appropriate level of risk exposure that we want to bear. And that's, so FTAs have, if you like, eased the skid, so they eased the way into the Chinese market. It's been really, really helpful for New Zealand firms moving into China. The risk, I suppose, is that we've become overexposed. So, for me, FTA coverage is much less an important deal than really understanding some of those kind of geopolitical risk drivers, of our relationships, and for firms to calibrate accordingly.
Yeah, thank you. And we do have a follow-on question related to free trade agreements. So do feel free to, of course, back this one to MFAT, and we can very happy to accept that. So this is more of a question around sort of follows on from your conversation about China and the US. So this is about the TPP. And if the US does rejoin, do you feel that this will have any sort of negative impact on our current relationship with China?
No, not particularly. I mean, one, I think the likelihood of the US rejoining the TPP or CPTPP is pretty unlikely. The US is not in the market for joining free trade agreements, nor do I think the current TPP members are likely to kind of want to unpick or unwind the deal to accommodate new US demands. So I think that's pretty unlikely, and the US has gone off on a slightly different track. It's signing the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as its last foray into this. So I think the chance of the US rejoining or joining the TPP is kind of is not a high probability thing. But even if it were to do so, I mean, obviously it would be a collective decision. You've got to have unanimity across the TPP members. So it wouldn't simply be a New Zealand deal. Even if we all supported, it wouldn't be simply New Zealand. It would be a broader group. So I don't think New Zealand's welcoming of that, and New Zealand would welcome it if the US wanted to do it. Would have much of an effect one way or the other. What would have a more material effect, I think, is New Zealand's attitude towards China applying. So China's application is on the table at the moment to join the TPP. I don't actually know what New Zealand's official stance is, but I expect New Zealand, as with many other countries, would be nervous. They don't want to say no, because if you say no to China, that invites perhaps a negative response. But also China is not I mean, in a sense, TPP was designed as a group of countries that provide a buffer against China. It doesn't say that in so many words. That was one of the founding intuitions, certainly from the US side. So I think the more likely source of friction in the TPP context is New Zealand's stance on China joining the TPP. I don't think there's broad support. And China doesn't meet the criteria. Lots of SOEs, lots of distortions. It's not a very open economy, as well as the geopolitics. But it's things like that I think become it would be more impactful in terms of our stance. But New Zealand is kind of has managed its bilateral relationship with China well, in the sense that it's kind of kept it calm. It's kept the relationship growing, unlike Australia, which has had periodic flare-ups, and various Australian exports are still sanctioned into China as well. But I guess my point is, for various reasons, be they TPP related or be they kind of geopolitical in origin, that period of smooth sailing, I think, is coming to an end. And although New Zealand Inc. and New Zealand firms don't want to have to make a choice between China and others, I think those choices are going to be increasingly forced upon us. So we need to get ready for, how do we make that trade-off? How much we're prepared to give? If push comes to shove, which side of the fence do we want to be on? Are we kind of part of the West, or do we kind of geographically align and say, look, our future's in Asia, of which China is an important part, and so we're kind of going to err on the Chinese side. So, figuring out what you think the end state is going to be, and using that to inform your kind of nearer term decisions. I think those are conversations that New Zealand firms and New Zealand Inc. Can't put off for too much longer.
Yeah, thank you. So following on from that, we've got a couple of questions here looking at horizons. So, you've talked about turbulence and, that we've come to the end of a period that was, reasonably settled. And questions around what do you kind of see the horizon of the turbulence being? Is it a few years or is it multiple decades?
Obviously, it's difficult to be too precise about this. I mean, history provides a partial guide or a partial answer to that question. So, the way that I think about these things is every 3-4 decades, the consensus or the accommodation that we've reached, domestic political and geopolitical, reaches a kind of a breaking point. Things that have worked well just stop working so well. And the last period we went through, a meaningful rupture was from the 1970s. Breaking Woods, OPEC and the oil price shocks, obviously the Cold War, Vietnam, and the like. And we moved from a system that was kind of reasonably settled after the conclusion of the Second World War, a bunch of institutions and arrangements and the like, and that kind of got pushed to an extreme and simply ceased to function after a while. And from the early to mid 70s until, let's say, the early to mid 80s, there was a period of economic, political, and geopolitical disruption as we kind of struggled to figure out what a new set of arrangements would look like that actually would be kind of helpful and useful and effective in the new world. And then from the 1980s, we began to kind of find our feet, so to speak, in terms of a set of arrangements that kind of worked better. And I think we're now reaching 3 or 4 decades on from that. We're now reaching the kind of the conclusion or the ending of that. So if you take that analogy, and no historical analogy is perfect, and this is not a perfect analogy at all, or by any stretch, but the 1970s was a decade of significant economic, political, geopolitical turbulence. And so if you use that as a rule of thumb, thinking about this kind of turbulence and disruption lasting for a period of, I don't know, perhaps up to a decade doesn't strike me as far-fetched. Now, it might be we've learned our lessons and we do this better. But if you think about the stakes at play, you think about and the big difference, I suppose, between the current experience and the experience of the 1970s when we had the Cold War and even the rise of OPEC, is that the US and China, the West and China, are much, much, much more deeply economically integrated. They spent the last 20, 30 years kind of integrating. And so that process of pulling apart, of decoupling, is a pretty significant rupture in the system. And if that's the case, that even compared to the 1970s, which was turbulent and bumpy, it might mean that the disruption is more prolonged, because you can't do this kind of decoupling. Even if you approach this in a very orderly, thoughtful way, decoupling of its magnitude is just going to be costly and messy. And just to give one small example, you look what's happening in Europe at the moment, as Europe tries to decouple from Russia, particularly in terms of energy. Now, it hasn't been a particularly orderly process, but it's enormously costly. Decoupling from China is an order of magnitude more substantial, given what China is, its centrality in the global economic system, its scale, and the like. So it strikes me that we are in for a very bumpy period. Again, this is not simply bad luck of having a pandemic followed in quick succession by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in sort of in 3-4 years, and we're kind of done. This strikes me as a circa a decade-long transition. And clearly, in addition to things that we have talked about, economics, geopolitics, simultaneously this time around, we've got the net zero transition, which is going to be enormously disruptive, both as a matter of economics and economic structure. Industry, energy, transportation systems and the like will need to be utterly transformed, as well as the direct physical effects of climate change, droughts, floods, extreme weather events. All of this is happening it's happening much quickly than we had expected even 3-4 years ago. So you've got that, as well as technology, quantum, AI. So, but the point, I suppose, is this is not simply a bounded disruption. This is an omnidimensional set of disruptions that are hitting. And I think if that's the case, it might be that 1970s is is kind of the low bar, if you like, of what we could meaningfully expect. And I think, so I would be picking at least the next decade to be really quite bumpy and really quite disruptive, with a whole range of both macro kind of aggregate shocks, but also a whole raft of sector or idiosyncratic shocks as well, depending on the sector that you're in. And clearly different sectors are differently exposed to technology and geopolitics and the like. There's going to be new growth engines. And again, just harking back to the 1970s analogy, although the 1970s is remembered as a bit of an economic wasteland, it's also where we began to see a lot of the technologies that we now take for granted, from Apple got its start, the internet got its start, GPS. So a whole bunch of stuff we now take for granted came out of, in very nascent forms out of the 1970s. And I think we're now, also seeing, just it's just, I guess, there's a range of stuff going on. And I think, there's going to have to be an accompanying amount of policy innovation as policymakers cope with this new world, both in kind of matters of foreign affairs, but also domestic economic policy. How do we think about fiscal and monetary policy? How do we think about skills and labour market policy to cope with rapidly changing labour markets and technology and demand for skills? It's going to be a very, very bumpy period. It's going to put enormous demands both on firms to navigate this world, but also on policymakers. But I think, once we get through that, although it's not fashionable to say, if your horizon is 3 or 4 decades, I actually think there's quite a lot to be positive about. So, I'm sort of deeply immersed in the day-to-day news flow of bad economic and geopolitical news. But also, if you lift your head, technology, even the net zero transition and the like, there's also quite a lot to be hopeful about. So this is not meant to be unmitigated stream of bad news. There are some positive things out there. And I think particularly when we get our act together and we figure out what institutions, what capabilities, what business models are kind of fit for purpose in this new world, there are some big opportunities out there as well. And my hope is that small economies like New Zealand, because we're, at least in principle, agile and responsive, can get our act together perhaps more quickly than some of the lumbering giants.
Wow, that's a super interesting picture that you painted there of the kind of sort of near future. Yeah, and I guess, as you've described that I mean, there's a global imperative for humanity, really, for everybody, for policy, for businesses, for citizens to pull together in one direction around climate, to address climate change. And I guess moving towards that kind of approach is certainly one of those positives that you talked about. There's a lot more awareness, there's a lot more initiatives. Businesses are in many cases doing what they can, and then we've got the distraction of some of the other areas that you've talked about that we're kind of, I guess, maybe not on the horizon necessarily when we started down this process. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting time.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up on that point, I think a lot of, particularly on climate and technology as well, a lot of this is going to be bottom up, right? So consumer, citizen, investor preferences on climate, on emissions intensity are changing quite rapidly. So yes, governments are making commitments to net zero, as they should. And New Zealand obviously has just put on emissions pricing on the agricultural sector, which is good and overdue. But a lot of this is also going to be it's going to be bottom up. And governments are going to have to be kind of responding and catching up in many cases to that. I think the other thing that makes this transition over the next, let's say, decade or so challenging is that many of these forces interact. This is not just technology and climate and geopolitics proceeding in their own kind of lanes. You don't need to use much imagination to figure out ways in which climate is going to affect geopolitics. War for resources, things of that nature, is going to affect domestic politics as energy prices increase. So, the world that we're going to have to navigate with all of these kind of various disruptions and tectonic plates kind of integrating and bumping up against each other is going to be really, really quite challenging. So again, don't underestimate the magnitude of the shocks and the disruptions kind of coming in the highway at us.
So I've got a slight pivot in one of the questions now. So this is a question which talks about the separation of the geopolitical blocks and the impact on tourism and immigration flows. Do you have any insights into that question?
Well, some. Through the pandemic, obviously for New Zealand, but also more broadly, but in New Zealand specifically, tourism went effectively to zero. It's going to be a slow road back, I think. China was circa 11% of inbound arrivals into New Zealand pre-pandemic. That's obviously now zero, and I think will remain at about zero for at least the next 12 to 18 months because of China's domestic policy stance in respect of COVID. I think borders will remain closed. But even after that, I think we are going to see more sluggish flows. I think China is becoming a more closed economy in the near term, but I also think going forward. So I think you will see, much as you see kind of geopolitically kind of shaped trade investment flows, I think you will see, to a lesser extent probably, but you will see to some extent kind of geopolitically shaped sort of people flows, be that tourists or migrants, in part because you don't particularly want to go on holiday in countries where you were seen as kind of the other or a rival or not particularly well liked. So, I don't know the various forecasts, but I would imagine that Chinese tourism into the US, for example, is not going to be where it was even when borders reopen. Is not going to be what it was sort of pre-COVID. And I think similarly for New Zealand and Australia. So that's true for tourism. It's true for export education. People come to New Zealand schools and universities. It's probably true for migration to an extent as well. So I think we will see a degree of sort of shaping. The big complication for New Zealand and for Australia is that we are in a part of the world that is geographically distant from countries that we would traditionally align ourselves with, which is one of the this is kind of a default line that runs through New Zealand foreign policy, as with Australia, is do we kind of align with our geographical neighbours, or do we align with countries that we kind of share kind of values and interests with? And so that's a complicating feature. So I think the short answer is yes, we should expect to see a degree of impact, some of these geopolitical fault lines on the profile of tourism and migration. I think in general anyway, New Zealand's going to be having slower inbound arrivals growth than we did pre-COVID, because I think partly we're a long way away, fuel prices are high, people are much more concerned about the emissions intensity of their tourism than they were. So I think New Zealand's tourism outlook is going to be a bit more challenged than it was pre-COVID. And I think on the migration side, it's probably good news for Kia, if not for the New Zealand economy. We are going to see significant outflows of New Zealanders going overseas, partly because of pent-up demand, partly because of tight labour markets and higher wages in Australia, in Asia, in Europe, and the US. That's kind of independent of geopolitics, but I think we are going to see a much more challenging environment for tourism and a much more negative, that's the right way of putting it, outlook for migration, certainly over the next several years. I think it's going to be quite different from what it was. So the glory days, I think, of the decade or so prior to COVID were very strong inward migration, including out of Asia, very strong tourism growth, particularly out of China. I think those days are behind us.
Right, thank you. So we have another question here, which harks back to your discussion on friendshoring. So this question is, as the US is leading nearshoring and friendshoring, effectively pulling economies like Japan and South Korea closer to it, what ramifications do you think this will have for us in New Zealand as China sees these geographically close countries as really important to kind of economically position themselves?
Yeah, so this is difficult, and countries that are physically more proximate to China are even more deeply exposed. So, Japan, Korea, Singapore, obviously Taiwan, are both deeply economically integrated into China and have been for some time. And those relationships have been growing strongly, a source of mutual benefit to China and to these other countries. But are also wary of China achieving a position of dominance in the region. And so in that sense, welcome a US kind of security backstop. They like having the US in the region. It's historically over the last several decades in general been a stabilizing force. But as these tensions between the US and China rise, a lot of these countries feel caught. And so although they don't want the US to back away from the region, they welcome a US security presence in the region. They'd even more welcome a US kind of economic and trade presence in the region, but the US has kind of walked away from that, TPP and the like. They are caught, so we're seeing a measure of pushback already. So various of the US initiatives around semiconductors and restrictions on technology transfer between other countries and China. Japan, South Korea, and others are becoming a bit wary because they don't actually want to be caught in the middle of these trade and economic disputes. So on the one hand, they're trying to balance deep street relationships with the US. They're trying to manage deep street relationships with China, and they are getting caught up in this growing rivalry. So quite how that resolves is difficult to foresee. And again, when I talk about decoupling, this is not kind of a binary proposition where you're either decoupled or you're not. It's very much going to be decision by decision, sector by sector. On this issue, I'm going to reduce exposure to China. On this other domain, not so much. There's going to be a stepwise incremental approach to this. But you're already seeing strains beginning to emerge in geographically exposed countries like North Asia, like Singapore and other parts of Southeast Asia. And New Zealand, although we're kind of one step physically removed, as is Australia, because of the nature of our economic exposure, we're going to be caught up in this as well, even if we don't particularly want to be. So the point, I suppose, is there's lots of worry lines around policymakers and firms in and around Asia in terms of how they balance, how they resolve, frankly, the space in which they have to balance, how aggressive China is going to be in terms of sanctioning countries that it views as kind of straying beyond its kind of red lines. So this is going to be tricky. It's going to be bumpy. Different countries will probably end up making slightly different determinations in terms of how they want to position themselves. But I think the thing that makes it even trickier for Asian countries is the US is increasingly not an open market. And so the ability of Japan, Korea, and others, there are various trade agreements that exist, but their ability to really penetrate the US market and have the US market open to exports from Japan, Korea is being limited on semiconductors, on electric vehicles, where the Korean car manufacturers basically got shafted by the new legislative provisions in the US, where you've got to have locally produced EVs to benefit from the various subsidies. So you've got countries that are really caught in a bit of a bind in terms of how do you maintain strategic space, how do you avoid being dominated by China that's increasingly assertive, with whom you've got historical tensions, but also ensure that your economy can keep growing, produce employment, and the like. So it's a very long way of saying it's unclear, but it is going to be very, very challenging. And friendshoring is fine or easier, I suppose, if you're the US or you're Europe. It's a somewhat more complicated proposition if you are right in the thick of it and you're kind of physically caught between these kind of multiple competing blocks, and you've got to make some choices, all of which come at a cost. Friendshoring and the like is a good deal easier. I was in Africa a few weeks back talking to investors there. If you're in Africa or Latin America, these are somewhat easier. It's easier to see kind of opportunities. And if you're in the Asia Pacific and you're kind of straddling between two blocks, or at least two blocks, it's a good deal more difficult. And all of this stuff comes at a cost. It comes at a cost for New Zealand. It comes at a cost for Japan and Korea. And this, as I said, is not going to be resolved easily. This will be the dominant policy conversation for the next 10 or 15 years is how do you place your bets? How much do you place on the table? It's not at all clear. It's going to be really, really tricky. That said, the US, at least in my estimation, is not going to soften, nor is China. So in a sense, you've got two of the kind of the economic and geopolitical kind of elephants, who I think are more likely than not to keep on doubling down. In Washington, it's one of the very few things on which both parties can agree on, and is domestically popular. In China, President Xi, he's intrinsically, I think, a nationalist, believes in the China dream. And again, in kind of autocratic regimes, playing the nationalism card is something that seems to work politically. So on both sides of the table, you've got kind of domestic political forces, I think, that are encouraging a more aggressive, more assertive behaviour. And the folk in the middle, of which New Zealand is one, have to figure out how you play that out, and it's not at all straightforward. Sorry for not giving a more sharp answer, but it's just
that's fantastic. Thank you. And I guess just thinking about new exporting businesses, so new businesses from New Zealand that are looking for the first time to go offshore, what advice do you give them in this new environment that might help them understand or figure out where's my best bet?
Yeah, so I think I'd say a few things. One, fantastic, because New Zealand needs many more firms that are internationally active. I talked about New Zealand earlier as being one of the small advanced economies, and it is. But of the small economies, New Zealand, by a significant margin, has the lowest export share of any of these economies. We export about 25% of GDP at the moment. The average is about 65%. And if you look across small economies, internationally facing activity is the productivity growth engine of their economies. In small economies, you can't rely on the size of the domestic market. And so this is one of the things that's really dragged on New Zealand's performance for decades. It's just we haven't grown enough businesses to scale. So my first reaction to your question is fantastic. Please do it. Do it at scale and do it quickly. I get that it's hard and difficult for many, many reasons that are well understood, but nevertheless do it. I think in terms of how you kind of thoughtfully approach the international expansion process from New Zealand in the world that I'm describing, which is disruptive and turbulent with geopolitical fault lines emerging. One part of the answer is it depends a good deal what sector you are in, right? So some sectors, some activities are much more, let's say, geopolitically exposed than others. So if you are operating in a sensitive sector, be it kind of technology like cyber or AI, you are much more likely to get kind of caught up in various forms of export control or investment sanction or the like. Similarly, if you're in pharmaceuticals, if you're in something like consumer goods, even if you're in food and beverage to an extent, they are less, not completely, but they are less geopolitically sensitive. So, so one part of the answer is kind of figuring out, what is the likelihood that you're going to get caught up in these kind of economic wars between the US and China, and kind of caught up in secondary sanctions and the like. So for many, not all New Zealand firms, you're not going to be operating in an enormously geopolitically exposed sector. But that's, I think, one thing to be really, really thoughtful about. Secondly, I would say diversification matters increasingly, because geopolitical risk is obviously one factor here, but economic risk in a conventional sense is another. The IMF forecast that I mentioned earlier out yesterday, a reminder of that. Many parts of the world are exposed to shocks. I mean, Europe is falling because of energy. The US may have recession because of rising interest rates. China is slowing because of COVID lockdowns and property. So you've got different shocks affecting different parts of the world. Now, it just happens at the moment they're all kind of occurring at more or less the same time. But in general, you want to make sure that you're not overly exposed to kind of idiosyncratic shocks in a particular market. And China, although large, and although in general, you can earn pretty good margin in China, is, I think, moving into a much more challenging state of its economic development, where the likelihood of slower growth and shocks is much, much higher. So I think also figuring out what your appetite is for country-specific economic and financial risk exposure. And it's a thing about diversification. Now, for a small New Zealand exporter, every market you go into has a fixed cost component. So you can't say, I'm going to enter 20 markets tomorrow. You do have to be thoughtful about what those 2 or 3 are. But so I think really thinking hard about what's your exposure to geopolitical risk. Secondly, how do you diversify your exposures to kind of conventional pure play economic and financial risk, and how do you manage that against the fixed cost of kind of diversifying your product footprint? I'd also say for, again, it depends on what it is that you are selling. But even, if you're a smallish firm, you don't have to be operating in the fastest growing economy in the world to make money. I mean, Europe, although it's pretty sluggish and it has economic headwinds that are well documented, is still a large, prosperous, safe market. And the New Zealand firm only needs a very, very tiny share of that market to make lots and lots of money. So also being thoughtful around, is it headline GDP growth that you're after, or do you just need a big market, even if it's not growing super quickly? And how do you balance that against, is there a risk-return trade-off and the like? So I guess the overall point is there's just an increasing number of dimensions that you need to be thoughtful about. And again, not just today, but also what does this look like over a 5-10 year horizon, because moving into a market has a high degree of path dependence. Once you're in, it's difficult to extricate and move into another market. And what China looks like today, for example, looked like 5 years back, is going to be quite different from what it looks like 5 years hence. So, I think being very, very thoughtful around kind of geopolitical risk profile and the degree which you expose, thinking about the optimal level of diversification, but also just thinking about, are there safe, kind of prosperous markets where you're less likely to be subjected to some of these these risk events. I think that's a useful thing to be thinking about as well. But overall, do it and do it at scale.
Great advice, and a fantastic place to end the Q&A. So yeah, thank you so much, David, for sharing all of that incredible information and pulling the world events together in an hour for us. It was really insightful for me to just hear your perspective and to get more of an understanding about those sorts of practical considerations that boards can have and that Kiwi exporters can have. So incredibly valuable. Thank you so much. So we'll be putting the links into the chat for David's Substack newsletter that anybody can sign up to. And just as a bit of a wrap up, we'll be sending out an email tomorrow to everybody who attended today, just with the recording of the video and potentially some questions that we didn't get a chance to answer in the session today. We've negotiated with David, and he's very kindly offered to answer some of these questions for us. So we'll be having some sort of either Q&A in a written form or maybe in a short video form that will also go up on that page. So thanks again, David, hugely appreciated, really valued the insights that you gave, and look forward to chatting at some time soon.
Great, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.